Have you noticed something strange happening in the economy right now? Normally, when unemployment rises, the Federal Reserve starts cutting interest rates to stimulate the economy. Businesses borrow more money. Consumers spend more. Jobs start recovering. But right now, something unusual is happening. Unemployment is slowly rising, but the Federal Reserve is still keeping interest rates stuck around 3.75%. And when I first looked at this situation, I asked myself a simple question. Why is the Fed refusing to cut rates when the job market is weakening? The answer reveals something much bigger about the economy. We may be entering something economists call stagflation again. Rising prices combined with a slowing job market. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because the last time the United States faced a similar situation was during the economic turmoil of the 1970s. Today, I want to walk you through what is happening inside the economy, why the Fed feels trapped at current interest rates, and why something called the tariff lag may be quietly pushing inflation higher even while the economy slows down. Before I jump into the explanation, make sure you subscribe to Dave Invests Smart, because on this channel I break down complicated financial and economic trends in simple language, so we can understand what is actually happening with our money. Let me start with something called the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. This is the core mission that guides every decision the Fed makes. Congress gave the Fed two main responsibilities. First, maintain price stability, which basically means keeping inflation under control. Second, maximize employment, which means supporting a healthy job market with strong hiring. Most of the time, those two goals move together. When the economy is strong, companies hire more workers and inflation rises gradually as people spend more money. When the economy slows down, inflation usually falls because people reduce spending and businesses lower prices to attract customers. But sometimes the economy enters a strange zone where these two goals start conflicting with each other. That is exactly what appears to be happening right now. Let me show you the problem the Fed is facing. Over the past year, the job market has started cooling. Hiring growth has slowed. Some industries have begun cutting jobs. And economists are seeing early signs that unemployment could rise further if economic growth weakens. Normally, the Fed would respond to this by cutting interest rates. Lower interest rates make borrowing cheaper for businesses and consumers. Companies invest more. Consumers spend more. Economic activity increases, and unemployment starts falling again. But there is a second force pushing against that decision. Inflation. Prices across several categories of consumer goods have started creeping higher again, and one of the biggest reasons has something to do with trade policy. Back in 2025, the United States introduced a new wave of tariffs on imported goods from several countries. Tariffs are basically taxes placed on imported products which make foreign goods more expensive. At first, many people did not feel the impact immediately. And that is where the concept of tariff lag becomes important. When governments introduce tariffs, the price effects rarely appear instantly in consumer markets. Instead, the impact slowly moves through the supply chain. Importers absorb the cost for a while. Retailers adjust inventory. Companies renegotiate supplier contracts. And eventually, those higher costs begin appearing in consumer prices months later. Economists call this delayed impact the tariff lag. And right now that lag is starting to show up in the economy. The tariffs introduced in 2025 are now filtering through supply chains and showing up in consumer prices in 2026. Electronics, appliances, clothing, and various manufactured goods are becoming more expensive because companies importing those products are paying higher tariffs. And those costs are eventually passed to consumers. That means inflation is rising again, even while the job market is weakening. Which brings us back to the Federal Reserve. Imagine you are sitting inside the Fed, trying to decide what to do. If you cut interest rates to support the job market, you risk increasing inflation because cheaper money stimulates spending. More spending pushes prices higher. And if inflation rises above 4%, the Fed risks losing control of price stability. But if you keep interest rates high to fight inflation, the economy may slow down further, and unemployment could rise. In other words, the Fed is stuck. This is exactly why economists are starting to use the word stagflation again. Stagflation is one of the most difficult economic environments for policymakers because the normal tools stop working. Cutting rates helps jobs but worsens inflation. Raising rates helps inflation but hurts employment. There is no easy solution. And that is why the current interest rate level, around 3.75%, looks like a compromise rather than a confident policy decision. The Fed is essentially trying to balance two opposing risks at the same time. On one side, they see inflation pressure caused partly by tariffs and supply chain costs. On the other side, they see a weakening job market. So instead of aggressively cutting rates, the Fed is waiting and watching. They want to see whether inflation stabilizes before making any major moves. Now, when I look at this situation, I think it reveals something important about how economic systems actually work. Most people imagine inflation as something caused only by excessive money printing or strong consumer demand. But inflation can also come from supply shocks. Tariffs increase import costs. Energy disruptions increase fuel prices. Shipping bottlenecks increase transportation costs. All of these factors raise prices even if the economy itself is not booming. And when supply-driven inflation happens at the same time as slowing growth, the result looks exactly like stagflation. This dynamic is also why financial markets are becoming increasingly sensitive to economic data right now. Every new inflation report, every unemployment report, every Federal Reserve statement. Investors are trying to figure out which problem will dominate the economy first. Will inflation fall enough for the Fed to start cutting rates? Or will price pressures remain strong, forcing the Fed to keep interest rates higher for longer? And that question has huge implications for investors. If the Fed eventually cuts rates aggressively, the stock market could rally because lower borrowing costs support corporate profits. But if inflation remains stubborn and the Fed keeps rates high, then certain sectors of the economy may struggle. Housing markets could slow because mortgages remain expensive. Small businesses may reduce hiring because financing costs stay elevated. Consumers might spend less as borrowing becomes more expensive. But there is another interesting twist to this story. Not every sector of the market reacts to stagflation the same way. Some industries actually perform better when inflation is elevated. Energy companies sometimes benefit because higher commodity prices increase their revenues. Commodity producers such as mining and agriculture companies may also see stronger pricing power. Meanwhile, sectors that rely heavily on consumer borrowing like housing or auto sales often struggle when interest rates remain high. This is why understanding macroeconomic trends becomes so important for investors. The economy is not just a collection of individual companies. It is an interconnected system where policy decisions, inflation trends, trade policies, and global events all interact with each other. Right now, the tariff lag is a perfect example of that complexity. A trade policy decision made a year ago is now influencing inflation data, which in turn affects Federal Reserve policy, which ultimately influences stock markets, mortgage rates, and employment decisions. Everything connects. When I step back and look at the big picture, I think the most important takeaway is this. The Federal Reserve is not refusing to cut interest rates because it wants to slow the economy. The Fed is hesitating because inflation risks remain too high. If inflation settles closer to the Fed's target over the next few months, we may eventually see rate cuts that support economic growth. But if tariffs and supply chain costs keep pushing prices higher, the Fed may stay stuck at current rates longer than many investors expect. And that uncertainty is exactly why financial markets are experiencing periods of volatility. Investors are trying to predict how long this delicate balance between inflation and employment will last. Will the economy stabilize? Will inflation fall? Or are we entering a new era where stagflation becomes a recurring challenge? Nobody knows the answer yet. But understanding the forces behind these decisions helps us stay calm and make smarter financial decisions instead of reacting emotionally to headlines. If you found this explanation helpful, subscribe to Dave Invests Smart because my goal with this channel is simple. I want to help you understand the deeper economic forces shaping markets so you can think like an investor instead of just following the news.